Welcome to After the Breach. This is episode 35. We're your hosts, Jeff and Sarah. And we're really looking forward to this episode, Jeff. I'm super excited to have Alexandra Morton on. I'm a little starstruck, to be honest.
Yeah, I'm a little nervous.
I have, grew up reading her book, Listening to Whales. I am partway through her latest book, Not on My Watch. I just really admire her, and I'm excited to hear everything that she's just lived such a rich life and done so much for whales and for salmon, and has, potentially so much to share with us. So really looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, this is going to be a great conversation, from talking about her days studying Orky and Corky and all the work, the amazing, incredible work that she has done defending wild salmon in British Columbia and the fight against industrial aquaculture.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Alexander, for joining us today. We are so excited to have you on. And I mean, like Jeff said before we got to recording, we're both a little bit starstruck. So thank you so much for being on and sharing what you know with our listeners, because they'll be, I think, just as excited about it as we are.
Absolutely. As I mentioned, I looked away for so long from the research on orca to deal with industrial salmon farming that I don't really feel comfortable presenting myself as an expert, because my colleagues learned so much while I was distracted. And I'm trying to catch up with them now and fill in on that. But I am happy to talk about what I know. Thank you so much for having me. And so much respect for this podcast. You've had some great interviews. I've learned a lot.
Thank you so much. Would love to know how you got your start in killer whale research. I know, lots of people that in our community down here have read your book, Listening to Whales. It's
one of the first ones I recommend to people who are like, oh, what's a good killer whale book to read? And I'm always listening for whales.
Interesting. Thank you. So I guess I was a strange child and was very, very uneasy with human communication. I just felt like there was so much room for lying and misunderstanding. And I was an awkward child because my interest was in animals, particularly reptiles and amphibians, which is not the way to become the popular kid in school. But I began to read all the work done by people that went into the wilderness to study animals. And I realized I needed to choose the animal that I wanted to spend my life studying. Because I was interested in non-human communication, I wanted a large-brained animal. So there was three choices: elephants, the great apes, or dolphins. And I just sort of randomly picked dolphins. I just didn't really want to go to Africa, I guessed. And I was, very, very much a homebody. And so I made my way eventually to Los Angeles, got permission to study bottlenose dolphins at Marineland of the Pacific near Los Angeles. And then Corky, the killer whale, gave birth to the first baby that had been conceived in captivity. And the curator, Tom Otten, asked if I would please mind moving my equipment up to the killer whale tank and record. Now, previously, I had always looked at the killer whales on the way to the dolphin tank, and I hate to say it, but I thought they were boring because they weren't doing anything. Whereas you go down to the dolphin tank, and it was just sheer craziness all the time, social interactions, speeding around, trying to grab me, pull my flippers in, pull my hydrophone in. It was a very interactive experience. But when I ended up spending 3 days awake watching this Corky handling her new baby, and then eventually the removal of it when she couldn't nurse it. And I was so deeply struck. The sounds just hit an inner chord. They were in my hearing range, which was really a pleasure after the dolphins, all that high frequency. And I could keep up with them. They were deliberate in their actions. They were slower. And I never went back to the dolphin tank, to the bottlenose dolphins. I stuck with Orky and Corky.
You tell some amazing stories in your book, and we've seen it in some films as well. would love to hear some of your favorite stories from your time with Orky and Corky. How long were you with them?
I worked with them closely for a period of about 6 years. And after the baby was born, we all knew there was a potential for her getting pregnant again. And I was really excited to study the development of language in the baby, because I thought it would give me a sense of like, where does the information reside in their calls, and what do they learn first? What's important? So I set up a study where I would go and watch them for 12 hours in the day one week, and then 12 hours at night the next week. And initially, I did it bi-monthly, and then when we found out she was pregnant, we went closer and closer. So I was spending a lot of time with these whales at night and in the early dawn, at times when there were no other people around. And I was very young. I was in my, like 21 when I started. And some of the things I saw, I was like, oh dear, I'm never going to be able to repeat these things because nobody's going to believe me. So one of them was this, I call it a ceremony that they performed at daybreak. And the way their tank was built, there was a stadium that rose up above the tank. And so there would be the sun would come up and there'd be some daylight, but by the time the sun came up and came over the bleachers and sent a shaft of light down to the side of the tank, Orky and Corky had already been involved for quite a while in this very special response. So as the months of the year passed, this shaft of light would hit the tank in different places. And leading up to before the sun got over the bleachers, they would start getting playful, and they would go up to this spot and just squirt a little bit of water on it. And then they go around. But once the sun came up and that shaft of light came down the tank wall and hit the water, well, now they came up and they pressed their tongues against it. They squirted water at it, and they became very, very active, generally with very raucous sex, usually initiated by Corky. And if a cloud went over the sun, this would die down. And then the cloud went away, it would come back. And I also saw one night I was there and there was a big lightning storm, and Orky spy hopped in the middle of his tank with his mouth open, making this very strange groaning noise, flicking his tongue at the lightning. So, yeah, now, some people say, look, they were in captivity, and so, the amount of stimulation they have is so low that this could be something they totally made up. But one of the things they did during this activity was they were really into synchronized behavior. And that, as you're aware, is a theme with orca. From the moment the baby takes its first breath, there's synchrony with the mom opening her blowhole. Well, these two whales would do these really complicated behaviors where they go up to the training platform, they both roll over, put the same edge of their flukes on the platform, and then raise one pectoral fin. So they're basically like spooning. And when I told the trainers about this, they're like, no, that's too many variables. That's too many things at once. So then I showed them pictures. And here they realized Orky and Corky had been holding out on them. Because, the laying, the orientation, and I watched them develop these, where they would go and they back up against the tank wall and then push off together. And so there was, lots of things they did like that. I also saw remarkable things where Orky, the male, would sometimes pick a child, and he would follow that child. And the child always caught on really quickly. And Orky would run along around with him, and he'd put his huge pectoral fin up and let the child touch him. And I was too young. I didn't have what it took to go up to the mom and just was like, hey, tell me about this child. I don't know whether it was a random pick or what he did. And the other thing I just loved about them is they would lie at night side by side talking. And there's no way my sound behavior correlation could touch that, because they weren't doing anything. They were two sentient beings in bed talking together. And the bond between them was was very inspiring and interesting for me.
Yeah, I'm floored.
Yeah, I have
Just floored
chills.
listening. Yeah.
Yeah, just incredible. Yeah, I'm almost speechless, which doesn't happen often. You eventually then made your way up to British Columbia and Johnstone Strait to turn your attention to wild killer whales and to Corky and Orky's family.
Yes. So when the next baby was born and she couldn't nurse it, I began to have doubts about anything in captivity. Like, did they even have their language right? Were their sounds correct? What else couldn't they do? And so I contacted Dr. Michael Bigg, who was at the Pacific Biological Station, was Fisheries and Oceans Canada. He was so different from the American scientists that I was working with. He was so free with information. And he's like, Orky's family was destroyed by the capture. I think he said there were 6 whales captured. Everybody was taken except for one male, and he disappeared, which we now know is more than enough to kill an adult male, to lose your entire family at one go.
Wow.
And he thought maybe they were A4s, but he said Corky's mom is still alive, and he sent me pictures of her family. And because he had seen her swimming in a cow-calf position with this A23 or stripe from the A5 pod during the capture operation. So he was pretty certain A23 was her mom. And so he sent me the pictures of the A4s, 5s, and 1s and said, go to Alert Bay in August and good luck. And I got a little 12.5-foot Zodiac. I had no boating experience, but I really wanted to do this. I brought 2 friends with me, and we literally found them on the first night. And that wasn't exceptional. They were there every day. At that moment, I put the hydrophone over, and I'm no longer hearing the tank drain. And I hear these calls rolling out across Johnstone Straits. And I see these fat and sassy little babies tumbling over their moms. I felt so much guilt that I was there and Corky was not. But I also took one sniff and was like, okay, this is my habitat. The wet whales, everything about it was perfect. And so I got off my nomadic life bus and went home and got my stuff and stayed.
I think we both know how that is, but yeah, I spent just over a week up there this summer, out with some of the northern residents, and a magic. I mean, I love San Juan Island, but it's a magical place up there.
It definitely is. I mean, I had my first wild killer whale experience up there, and it completely changed my life. I wouldn't be here doing this and without that experience up there. It really is such a magical place, and the northern residents there's just something really magical about them, and really just emotional, compelling. Like, there's so many words, but there's just something about them.
It's interesting you say that, because I always think of the southern residents as being much more expressive. Like fly hopping and the breed singing, and but yeah, they are different, and the place is amazing, and we're very lucky that it basically staying the way it was.
Speaking of that, that's a kind of a good transition. At some point, you turned your attention from killer whales to wild salmon as the industrial aquaculture came into your area. And I'm very curious, several things. I mean, first, what is it that you were seeing, and what compelled you to totally shift gears? And one of the themes that we hit a lot in this podcast, talking to people that end up spending their change, making these huge life changes, is the fear and risk that is involved in taking these big leaps of faith and making these big changes. And especially with something like taking on a large industrial aquaculture and a huge global industry that you have tackled.
Yeah, it's not just the industry, it's the Canadian government and the Norwegian government. But yeah, I know, I felt all those things. What happened initially was I thought it was a great idea. And I actually took a job on a salmon farm because I found that would be a way that I could continue to earn a living. Because by then my husband had passed away diving, and I was raising a small child on my own in a really remote community, float house only, no electricity, no ferry, about an hour run by speedboat from a near town. And so I was always looking for some security, financial way to stay out there. I didn't notice. I I was so blind when I first came to these waters. I didn't know what's normal. I didn't know what should appear in the spring or the fall or the summer. I didn't know what the tides meant, nothing. And so it was an old fisherman that said, "Hey, Alex, they're putting these fish farms in all the wrong places. They're putting them where the rock cod, the salmon, and the herring are. And could you write to DFO?" Because he knew that I was continuing to work, not officially with Mike Bigg and Graham Ellis, but all of my transient sightings, for example, went to them. And so I was like, sure. I was so pleased that the fisherman asked me to do something, because I was always coming to him saying, why are the whales doing this? What's here? What is this fish? And he was a real teacher to me. And so I wrote the first letter, and the government wrote back, "Dear Ms. Morton, don't worry, we got this, run along and play." That was basically the tone of the letter. I'm like, oh, okay, wait a minute. I didn't communicate properly. So I tried again, and the postmistress, we got mail by seaplane in Echo Bay. The postmistress said for a few years there, I kept the post office open because I wrote 10,000 pages of letters. I had a little mark I made over my printer upstairs in the float house. I'd turn on the generator, get this little printer. It was before internet, right? And then in 1995, they started playing acoustic harassment devices on the farms to try to repel the harbor seals, which had learned how to scare the Atlantic salmon, and the salmon would go press themselves against the bottom of the pen, and then the seals would just suck them out between the mesh. They didn't even have to get in. And so they began to play these sounds at 198 decibels, wow, which is the level of sound at a jet engine at takeoff. So the microphone's right at the jet engine. And they're designed to cause pain in the seal's ears. Okay, well, kind of a good idea. They're not shooting them. Well, they tried, but it didn't work. There was always more seals.
Right.
So they began to play these, and one day I was out, and the A1s came in. They came in Feist Sound, and they encountered the first acoustic harassment device. And before I stuck the hydrophone down, they were behaving very strangely. They were cruising along at a 45-degree angle with their heads out. And I'm looking up. I'm like, okay, what are they looking at? Is there a rainbow? What's going on up in the sky? I wasn't thinking about their ears. So anyway, I threw the hydrophone over, and there was this really loud chirping noise, kind of a cricket-like thing. And the needles on my tape recorder just plastered into the red and stayed there. And so I turned it down. And anyway, it turned out it was these acoustic harassment devices, and those whales never came back. That was 1995. They still haven't come back.
Wow.
Now, the big orca, the transients, they rerouted themselves so that they could not pass directly in front of a farm. And the reason this was so clear to me is because then I was in a float house living in Kramer Pass, which was the alternate route that they picked. And I had never seen them there before. And then they became common. And so they persisted, but the fish-eating whales left. And so I wrote a paper on this with Helena Simmons from Orca Lab, Paul Fong's partner, because it was a rare case in which we knew where the animals were. They had vanished from the Broughton, but we knew where they were because they're photo ID'd, obviously. And so I was able to show displacement by sound. Now, displacing a killer whale in British Columbia, in Canada, is against the law. And I thought, okay, I can fix this. Well, I couldn't. It didn't matter. The companies weren't fined. There was no response from government. Now, eventually the salmon farming companies turned them off because it attracted seals. And for a period of years, my neighbors and I were almost hitting seals with our speedboats repeatedly. They would come up oblivious that we were just about to run over their heads. And then they'd see us and just like freak out and dive. And, Billy Proctor, who by then was in his 60s and been born there, he had never seen this. None of us had ever seen it. And so I'm guessing that the seals were willing to risk their hearing for the enormous oil content of these farm salmon, which they need to make fat. So anyway, it had a dinner bell effect. Fish farmers turned them off. And I began to get the understanding that this industry was beyond the law. Because as you all know, if a whale watch boat or a photographer harassed a whale and caused him to deviate from his path, never mind abandon a whole archipelago, they'd be held to pay. And right so.
Absolutely.
Not for this industry. And then, so I began to spend more and more time researching it, going to meetings, engaging in government processes, reviewing all the applications for new sites. But then in 2001, the sea lice outbreak became apparent to me. And I was like, okay, I just need to focus on this. And for including this year, the last 24 years, I've been studying sea lice infection on juvenile wild salmon as they pass salmon farms. But I resisted this. As a child, as I told you, I read all these books about people that went into the wilderness. And there was a common thread in every one of these books. Part one was always, wow, the place, what you see with the animal that you're studying, the adventure. Part two was invariably, this whole thing is falling apart because of something people are doing. And part three, with grad students, talking to politicians and bureaucrats, traveling, you're no longer in the field with the animal that you went to spend your life in the field with. And so I was like, there's just no way I'm going to do that. So when the logging issue with the Fitica came up, I did nothing. I feel terrible. I did nothing about Corky in captivity. I just had this ruthless laser beam focus when I was a young woman. But what I didn't realize in that, behavior was that I was living in this environment with these whales. It was happening to my home. And the changes were obvious. And so, you mentioned that feeling of doubt when you do this. Well, when the orca left the Broughton Archipelago, I kept thinking, well, I was a real scientist. I would go to Southeast Alaska. I would go somewhere else. I can't be a whale scientist if there's no whales. Then this other part of my thought was, well, somebody's got to measure the disappearances. Because, if the tree falls in the forest and nobody hears it, does it fall? Oh, yeah, it falls. But nothing gets done about it. And I also had a little boy in school, a little one-room school, an adorable little community, really. And so I was like, well, maybe I don't want to move just because I'm lazy, because this is my home, because I'm comfortable here. Anyway, these thoughts jumbled around in my brain endlessly, feeling guilty, but just pouring myself into providing all the research possible, the data, the published science that the policymakers of Canada would need to see that open net pen aquaculture was incredibly dangerous because it amplifies pathogens, just like chicken farms, pig farms, beef farms. We don't let wild birds land in the chicken farms because we're terrified of avian flu, and we should be. But when it came to the salmon and the ocean, well, they just threw all that knowledge out. You couldn't see it unless you really were looking. And so I gave it up, and there were days where I was rushing out to get my beach change done on the salmon, and I'm passing a bunch of big orca. And I could not believe I was doing this because, I'd spotted orca in the shower previously, and boy, I'm out of that shower in the boat. For my life, yeah. And But now they're gone. I'm very, very lucky, and it's very rare, but in the end, it was very, very worth it.
Well, I think we're all grateful that
Yeah.
for the work that you did and all the research, because I think you uncovered more than anybody else the disease and pathogens that salmon farming brought into the area. And I know it took a lot longer probably than you thought it would to get government to actually do something and acknowledge what was going on.
Absolutely. And you know what I did? And it turned out there wasn't a lot of forethought on it, but when the sea lice epidemic hit, I opened my home to researchers who would come in to help me study this because it needed somebody with mathematical modeling skills. It needed somebody who government would listen to. So from a big university, which I was not from. And so the brilliant students came. They so overran the place. I eventually moved out and it became a field station. But they're the ones. So I was the icebreaker. I thought initially, I did the initial work to show this was a real problem. But then these young men and women just filled in behind me, and they are extraordinary. And we now have salmon disease science in British Columbia that is unparalleled, where they're reading the immune system of the salmon, which allows the salmon to actually talk and tell you what's wrong before their eyeballs are falling out and they got big open sores. And this allows you to pinpoint the place where they're getting hurt. So, and I have to say, there was a beautiful feeling about this group that formed, but then I had a young daughter. She grew up with them. The place was just teeming with, scientists that were super engaged. We all had government and industry beating on us, so we kind of banded together. And it was a remarkable phase. But what was so disturbing was that nothing we discovered could convince the politicians to say no to this industry. And so I began using the Access to Information Act, which in Canada allows you to go online and you can order the conversation between two bureaucrats on a certain issue between two dates. Well, I was flabbergasted. I saw them talking about me, about my colleagues, about what was really going on the farms, about the fact that they were seeing these diseases, which they publicly denied. I still could not make this stick, not with the scientific journals that they were publishing in, not with government, politicians. There was for a while there was just this panicky feeling that there was no solid ground. There was no higher authority. There was no way to stop this. And I realized this course is not just going on with industrial aquaculture. This is oil, big pharma, on and on and on. And so I learned a lot about this whole process. I went from the observer writing letters, a nice little woman, showing up, being very polite, to doing the hardcore science, publishing in top journals, including the Journal of Science. And then I turned to activism. I led a march all the way down Vancouver Island that ended up with 10,000 people in front of the BC legislature. I canoed with 100 people down the Lower Fraser, and we took over a street of Vancouver. And we walked into the Cohen Commission, into the decline of the Fraser sockeye. That did nothing. The protesting did nothing. And then through a series of miraculous events, I ended up occupying salmon farms with First Nations under their auspices in the Broughton for 287 days through the winter. So think about that. These are steel structures. There's no roads to them. You got to get there by speedboat, very spotty cell phone. It's freezing. But everybody was peaceful, stayed on message. And finally, the First Nation leadership stepped in and they realized they're going to have to do something about this. And now they are so engaged and haven't given up. They've chased them out of the Broughton, but they're so concerned because now they really know what is going on in these farms, but they've kept going. So to anybody involved in these kinds of issues, I do have advice and I am available for that because my heart just goes out to anybody that runs into one of these walls that are pressing in, smothering, destroying, crushing one of Earth's ecosystems. And how can you possibly stop that? It's not easy. And I lucked out. It's not like I figured it out, but I did find a path.
It is amazing. And there were legal decisions. I remember you mentioned the Cohen Commission. I remember when that was going on, and it seemed like that gave some hope that something was going to change, and yet it really didn't. And then there were follow-up court cases. I think there was one that was talking about the federal regulations in Canada and the conditions that had to be met, but the salmon farm licenses had a lower standard than the actual federal regulations, and then still like nothing was changing.
Oh yeah, I've been to court I think 6 or 7 times now, and I've never lost. One case was denied and said it didn't go through, but the other ones I won every one of them, and 2 of them were to stop the federal government from putting diseased Atlantic salmon carrying an Atlantic disease into Pacific waters. I won both of those, and it didn't stop. So, I mean, these are worrisome signs that something is very wrong in this democracy that we live in. And I kept trying to follow the threads, and I became, super obsessed with this. Just like, I had twitches under my eyes. I'm not sleeping anymore. I'm just hunting this thing. What? Why? What is the source of this? Where is the lever to turn this off? Because you can farm salmon in a closed containment. People are doing it. But it's easier and more lucrative, of course, to do it in the water. So I wasn't even saying don't do it anymore. It's just like, you cannot pour your pathogens out into the Pacific Ocean. And I think that international trade laws figured huge. So, for example, everybody knew bringing Atlantic salmon into the Pacific coast was a very risky thing to do. In fact, our Director General of DFO at the time said, we could bring in a disease we've never heard of. Well, that's exactly what they did. Piscine orthoreovirus had never been heard of, and now it's everywhere. And it arrived when the salmon farm started bringing in Atlantic salmon. It's from the Atlantic. But DFO, the government, Canada, was not allowed to prevent the introduction of Atlantic salmon because it would have put the salmon farming industry in British Columbia at an unfair advantage on the global market. And so, people in government were trying to stop this, and they said, Alex, one day lawyers showed up in suits, and that was the end of it. Nothing we said ever made a difference again. The Atlantic salmon were coming. They came, millions of them. So, in fact, when the Atlantic salmon got out in Washington State, they called it a lunar eclipse problem, but it wasn't. Anyway, with Cook Aquaculture, I was able to identify those salmon because they were carrying an Icelandic strain of Piscine orthoreovirus, and they ended up in Johnson Strait. So these are the things we face, and I'm very grateful to organizations like EcoJustice, these environmental law firms, because you do have to go after the law and set precedent. But in the end, occupying, just standing in the way for a long time quietly, which is incredibly boring and stressful, that's what works. Yep, that's what works.
That's incredible. You found an incredible pathway to create change, and change is happening. So the farms are gone now from your area. Is that correct?
They're mostly gone from the Broughton. We had about 100 farms. We have about 50 left. And the only reason that we have those is that they have made a deal with First Nations in a few communities. But these First Nations are not being properly informed. I've been involved in the meetings where scientists who are pro-fish farming come in and they manipulate the facts. And, we see this in climate change too. These types of scientists, in my view, are the most dangerous animal on Earth, because they're allowing the unraveling of these networks that keep things alive. Now, I have this very strong feeling now that places that make clean air, water, and food should have a covenant placed on them now, so that they are allowed to continue doing those things, not for the environment, but for us. Like, we can put it in those terms now. It's so dire. So many people fighting these fights, and it's going to be a balance, I think, as things get worse. We're tipping already. I mean, alternative energy has become a big deal. I've been off grid the majority of 40 years. I'm still off grid. And the way that technology has changed, it's incredible. So, I mean, there is a lot of hope, but I just want to say to everybody, if you know there's something wrong and it's destroying the ecosystem around you, please don't give up. Because don't ever say, and I hear this all the time, oh, I'm just an average person. There's nothing I can do. Well, I'm pretty average too. I don't have any superpowers except that I just wouldn't let go. So that's what won in the end. And don't let the anger consume you, because it'll kill you, basically. It's very damaging to your system.
Sure. We've talked about the whole process that you've been through, and one thing I wanted to do just real quick is for those listeners that maybe aren't familiar with salmon farming in general, because, you know, we have people that come out on tours with us that ask, like, well, what about salmon farms? Are they, you know, and we have the whole long spiel about why they're not great for us, for the environment, et cetera. But for those listeners that we have that maybe aren't familiar with salmon farming, what is a salmon farm? What kind of fish are in the salmon farms? Why is it such an issue? Where are they placed? That kind of thing. Maybe we could just talk about the basics of it.
Yeah, difference between open net and closed containment.
Sure. So salmon farms are feedlots because they grow as many animals as possible, fast as possible, on an unnatural diet. And feedlots give an advantage to pathogens. So in the wild, a virus wants to kind of live lightly on you. We saw this with COVID, right? It started much more virulent, and then it toned down because the virus, not that they have wants and needs, but a virus will evolve to coexist. And so it's a balance between being virulent, which means replicating, and letting your host live as long as possible. But in captivity, in feedlots, what happens is everybody's going to die in 18 to 24 months. There's no reason for a virus to try to live lightly on its host, because its host has a short life. And so the whole direction of virus evolution in feedlot is to hit hard and fast, to become super virulent, explode, replicate, infect as much as you can. And of course, what goes on in these farms comes out of the farm. The reason they have nets around these farms is so that all the waste from the fish, all the fish manure, goes through the nets, which is on the order of tons per day. Tons go in of food, tons go out. So what nature does is when there's somebody sick, nature sends in a predator. Boom, gone. Take care of that virulent pathogen so that it doesn't spread. Nature cannot send her predators into the farm. And so what happens is so tragic. So the farm fish, they get sick and they're just lying against the side of the net, but they're still alive because there's no predator. They might recover even, but in the meantime, they have shed billions of the bacteria, the virus, the parasite, whatever it is they're infected with. And the wild fish get it. Oh, well, now the wild fish are subjected to all the natural laws, and the ones that are sick die, but it doesn't turn off the faucet. The pathogen just keeps coming. And so it's this really unnatural, deadly situation. It is exactly like walking your child through the infectious disease ward of a hospital on her way to school. She gets exposed, might become a carrier, and then you put her into a high density, so the school of fish that are migrating north and meeting out into the North Pacific, and now the infection spreads. And if the salmon farming industry could turn off sea lice, viruses, bacteria, they honestly, in my view, they would have. Because they're making heaps of money doing this. They want to keep doing this. This is why they've so messed with the truth and the data and what's really going on. It's because they really want to keep doing this, but they can't. They have no tools to stop these viruses. The bacteria are becoming antibiotic resistant, and sea lice turn out to be quite a remarkable little creature. And absolutely everything they've thrown at them, the sea lice have become resistant to, whether it's a neurotoxin or a power washer or fish that come and bite the lice off of them, cleaner fish, they call them. And now they're using a really dangerous thing, and that is fresh water. They're sucking all the farm salmon into boats with fresh water, and the lice are becoming resistant to fresh water. Well, then they're going to go up the rivers into the lakes. It's just like, it's sheer madness. So you can do them in tanks, and you're in control of your pathogens. You're in control of your water temperature. You don't get attacked by jellyfish and blah, 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 all these things that are impacting the salmon farms. But it's more expensive, and it's a long-term deal. And for us, we just have Norwegian-based companies here. They clearly don't want to do this. So now the Canadian government has banned fish farms, but not until 2029, which there could be 6 different governments by then. Right, you're right. Disturbing.
In your opinion, do you think that we're going to see a day without open net farms in British Columbia? Do you think that is possibly around the corner?
We absolutely are. I mean, they're going to either kill themselves off because they are breeding all these very virulent diseases and they can't control the lice anymore. I mean, right now, 2 of the companies are only operating 30% of their farms, which we don't know why. So they're dealing with problems here, one way or another. But will Canada stop it? I doubt it. Just this transition process, which is this unbelievable amount of our taxpayer dollars are going into a soft landing for this industry, when the industry itself can just suddenly close a bunch of farms. You know, they don't care about employment. But the factor that is going to make all the difference and has made all the difference here are the First Nation leaders who value wild salmon. And Canadian law was forced to give them power to make these kinds of decisions. They always had the power, but they had to go to court to prove it. And they did that. They've done that legwork. And now I'm working with leaders like the leadership of the Numgis First Nation, the Quaker, and others. And I'm like, wow, these are real leaders. They are thinking about the future generations. The interesting thing about First Nations people is you'll never hear them say, this gets any worse, I'm out of here. Nope. They're tied to the land. They're one with it. They're not perfect. There's all kinds of corruption in First Nation government and people. But when their traditional, ancient government and laws and values are in place, it is so remarkable and inspiring. Their laws developed at a time when they would literally die if they lost the salmon or the deer or the bears or any of the things they needed. And so their laws are very aligned with the laws of nature. It's so different. So I have all the time in the world for First Nation leadership that want their wild salmon to be protected from this. But I do not speak to bureaucrats anymore. I do not have enough years left in my life to be fooled around with, to have them furrow their brows, wring their hands, make me feel like I was heard, and then trot up and just ignore me entirely.
I think we both understand that.
Yeah, definitely. And what you're saying is very hopeful for wild salmon in British Columbia. And what can people do, not just in British Columbia, but in Washington State and other parts of the world, to help protect and bring back wild salmon? I think you've kind of talked a little bit about positive changes that you're already seeing with some of the farms already gone.
Oh, it's incredible. So there's this little river this year called the Theodosia. It had an average of 6,500 fish, chum salmon for the last, 7 years? There's 52,000 in there right now. The same thing happened with the pinks. The pink salmon are a faster return, so this has been going on for a little while. But these chum that you and I are seeing come back, they're the first generation to go to sea, where all those farms between Campbell River and the mainland, so just above the Fraser River, were all removed. And I studied them and published that they had 96% fewer sea lice on them. And so I knew they were going to be good. And I was telling people, "Ooh, let's watch for these 4-year-old chum. You know, they might be good." And everybody's like, "Yeah, Alex, don't predict salmon. It's too unpredictable." I'm like, "Yeah, no, I know, but I'm just saying they had a better shot." Well, you know, they're just pouring through. It's amazing. And Washington State also got rid of the farms. You got rid of them first. In fact, you were a huge inspiration, and I think you bolstered the courage of our politicians, but you are also taking out dams. And that is remarkable. So fish are just accessing their spawning grounds again, which obviously they need, and they are responding. Now, salmon are talking. They're telling us some really interesting things, because the fish in Washington and in British Columbia are rebounding amidst climate change, high water temperatures in the rivers, and droughts, and ocean acidification, and all of these dangerous things. But what they are saying is, if you get out of our way and you just let us get to see them back to our spawning grounds, we can do a lot with that. And the other thing I would add, and I know it's a difficult message, but hatcheries are an idea that came about from logging. Now, think about the male salmon when he goes up the river. He's entered fresh water, so his whole body's changing. He's swimming up a mountain. He cannot feed. Everything's trying to eat him. He's growing gonads. So, so that's a big energy budget. And yet, on top of that, he turns red. He grows straight. He grows a hump. He grows teeth. He puts on all of this regalia. And what he's doing is he's advertising to the female, and he's saying, "Hey, baby, I went out to the Pacific Gyre, and I came back with all this for your kid. Do you want it?" And the female's like, "Yeah, no, you." And that's how, so when you travel up the Fraser River, for example, and you see all these different kind of sockeye, I'm like, how could these all be sockeye? The Adams River is this great, big, deep-bodied animal. And the Chilco is like a bullet. And way up at the head in the Stewart, they're tiny. They've gone thousands of kilometers up a river. So when humans decide which fish mates with which fish, they take the female and they rip open her belly and they take the eggs and they fertilize her with a male she did not choose. You're taking away a superpower that these fish have to rapid evolve. And as we throw climate change at everything, including ourselves, the ability to rapid evolve is going to become the difference between survival and not. And so for people who want to help salmon, there's a few things you can do. One, don't buy farm salmon in the supermarket. And if it means you can't afford wild salmon, I am so sorry. But when you do that, you're feeding a monster that is killing killer whales in the end. And number two, you have some remarkable politicians that are making a huge effort with the removal of these dams, with the removal of salmon farms. They need your support. Sometimes we forget and we just go after our politicians when we're angry at them. They really need you to stand visibly beside them in some way. Figure out how you're going to do that, whether it's posting on social media or creating signs or standing with them when they have open meetings. Support them when they do the right thing. And then join a streamkeeper group who are going out there and improving, repairing, healing the habitat. That's all salmon need from us, is the habitat.
Yeah.
And for people working in hatcheries, I know they care deeply. I was one of you. But we have to, we have to change as we learn new things. And the fish are talking to us. So they're teachers, and we could listen to them and all benefit enormously.
Absolutely. I think one of the things I talk about with people, and the salmon conversation comes up almost every time we're out, is that, they can be so resilient, but we need to get out of their way, as you said. If we give them an inch, they'll take a mile, but we have to remove ourselves from the picture to do that.
We're so fortunate that salmon are so resilient that they will do the heavy lifting. They'll do all the work if we get out of the way.
And that's the hardest part.
Yeah.
I had no idea. I wouldn't let myself even think about whether or not they would survive all of this if I did succeed in getting the farms out. And so, yeah, I'm so starstruck by what they can do. I went to this little river in a town south of me called Courtney, and I literally sat in the mud because there was no place dry to sit and watched them for 3 days. Just the courage, their bodies are falling apart, and yet they're busy and they're mating, they're putting those eggs down into the gravel. It was just, I don't know. It makes me feel very, very good. It makes me feel like I'm on the big team.
It's incredible. It's so encouraging, and it's amazing that you're seeing such big results so quickly.
And I think that's been a theme, with the removal of the dams on the Elwha, even with the Klamath River dams coming down and the fish farms too. Like, this is a recurring theme we're seeing with salmon, where when we get out of their way, they're moving a lot faster than we would ever predict them to.
Thank you. Yeah, you're exactly right. It's a theme with them, and this isn't the only time we've seen it. So there's the naysayers, and they're like, "Oh, Alex, it's just this, it's just that, it's just that." I'm like, okay, well, we're going to be watching next year and the year after. When after that, we're just going to see what happens.
What's next for you? Now that the farms are on the run and they're being removed, where do you turn your attention?
I'm just like, okay, where was I with the whale work? So I put a lot of effort into correlating sounds with behavior. But as you all know, sometimes maybe I should have studied elephants or something. You can see them, you can follow them, you can study their scat, you can see all their social signals. Whales are very difficult. And so the behavioral data we end up with is very poor compared to the rich data that we get from the vocalization. So I think correlating sound with behavior is clumsy, like building with alphabet blocks. But AI has caught my attention. These researchers that found that the sperm whale codas, there's actually more. And there's actually little things going on about how they produce these codas and where they sync up the clicking patterns with their conversational partners. And suddenly the amount of information that these codas can carry multiplies. And so I'd like to pursue that, because I have many, 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 many hours of recordings of Orky and Corky and then Corky's family. And so I'm going to, and I'm digitizing these, which is so interesting to listen to yourself 40 years ago. There I was, a young woman with a baby, a husband, and a puppy in a boat. I was like, I thought I was handling it better. See, Alex today is like, hey, woman, what are the whales to see? We got the sippy cup, but anyway, so yeah, I'm going back to that, and I'm just reading everything that my colleagues have written. I'm calling up them and talking to them, and I am currently talking with Dr. Lori Marino about the brains of these whales. And when you look at the structure, we have similarities, but we have differences. And you're like, okay, well, they're looking at the world with different senses. And you just have to keep opening up your mind as to what's possible, and try not to nail anything down, so that if you do figure something out, it's not impeded by a block that you put there by saying, this is the way the world is, when we really don't know. And you can see with sound, and you have an entire paralimbic lobe that we don't have in our emotional center. Well, we don't know. So yeah, I'm really trying to figure out how to go at this. We're never going to be able to say, okay, this sound means this. We all pretty well know that the killer whale calls denote a sense of emotion, and you can figure out like what state they're in basically, but there has to be more. And so I'm on that path.
Sweet.
Yeah.
Well, we look forward to seeing where that path takes you.
Thank you. I also work with various First Nation leadership on fish farms, but I'm trying to keep that on the side of the desk.
One thing that we usually ask our guests, and you told us some amazing stories about Corky and Orky. Would love to know if you have any favorite or most memorable experiences with wild killer whales.
Yeah, there's a few. I mean, one that just really is like a beautiful crystal in memory was the first time I encountered the whales in the dead of winter. And my husband and I and our little boy, poor little guy, he didn't know better how strange this life was. But we were running around looking for whales every single day because we didn't know what the routes were through the Broughton Archipelago. We didn't know anything. And one day we round the corner and Kinkum Inlet is completely covered in snow, the sides of the mountains. And there's a family of whales blowing, and it wasn't Biggs, it was A5. And it was just like, it was a whole tumult of emotion. But the one that really rang true was, Alex, you're in the right place. You've come to where this family knows it's safe to come in the winter. And I wanted to be able to study them in small groupings. I think now that might have been wrong. But anyway, I wanted to study them in small groupings so that I could keep track of what everybody was saying and doing. And so that was a huge moment. And then there was another, normally I really don't like it when the whales pay attention to me, but there was this one moment where A5, who's gone now, but he was a magnificent large male, came up very close to the boat. And as he opened his blowhole, I decided I would make what we call an N3, which goes like this. And so I clapped my hands and I did it as loud as I could. And with Corky and Orky, they use this sound to begin and end conversations. And wild orcas will often use it when they're trying to decide which way to go. It's a very interesting call. I think it correlates with synchrony. Anyway, A5 dived, and then he spy hopped within inches of the Zodiac. And he comes up, we are like eye to eye. And he was just checking what is in that boat. And I thought, oh, I don't know what I said, but I said something that he heard and meant something to me. My filmmaker husband is like, hey, Alex, I'll never do that again without the cameras rolling. And as many times as I did it again, A5 never looked in the boat again. He'd figured it out. He's like, okay, you're mimicking. That's cool. That's great. I know you can do that now. I'm moving on. But that little moment was huge. And then there's other things. There was this it's so hard to know what they're doing, but there was this one time where I was with the A30s, and A30 goes around the corner in Tribune Channel, and she's socializing with a bunch of females, and her kid, A50's in the back, socializing, and you don't really think they're paying attention. But as soon as she got around that corner, she whipped around, comes back around the corner, vocalizing, and her daughter just starts porpoising towards her, team up, and off they go. And I'm like, oh, we're super similar. I'm always listening for my kids. And when that drops out, but it was like a moment of understanding, just a tiny second. And that it speaks to how hard it is to know what they're thinking and talking about. That's such a tiny little insignificant moment. I would remember it decades later. But that's the way it is studying killer whales. You have to take these tiny little things and kind of build them together.
They're such amazing animals that they give us all these incredible, thoughtful moments.
Mm-hmm. They've been very tolerant of us, and I have a lot of trouble putting my boat on the water with them at the moment. So I'm up on a cliff, and I'm tuned in to Orca Live with Orca Lab. If people haven't listened to it, it's orcalab.com or .org.
Yeah, we'll put a link in the show notes to that. Oh, their hydrophones they're just incredible.
Like as we're talking, I'm getting some messages like this mystery combination of the G's and A's that showed up here on December 2nd and here are still here on the 3rd. People are kind of figure out who they are just from their calls. So it's a research tool, but it's also, we've been listening to the humpbacks singing on it as they get ready to go to Hawaii, hoping for a date. And I just love it. It's the backdrop of my life.
It is. I think I mentioned to you over email that when I was living in Cleveland, I would have it playing in my office all day long. That's right.
Funny how landlocked people are driven to study whales. I mean, I'm from the Berkshire Mountains of Connecticut, but it happens to us.
Yeah, it's amazing. It really is. Well, Alex, thank you so much for coming on. I can't tell you how much we appreciate you taking time to chat with us. And
well, thank you. I listen to your podcast all the time. I've learned so much. And so thank you for taking the time to share all this information and allow other people
Of
to hear.
course. It's our pleasure. What an amazing conversation.
yeah, I so many times I got chills from her stories. She's an incredible storyteller.
Yeah, if you heard me just going, yeah, in the background, that was just my brain had like shut down.
Yeah, she's just absolutely incredible and so grateful that she came on the episode and just amazing conversation. Just I could sit and listen to her talk all day long. Yeah. So we're gonna leave it at that. I don't think there's anything that we can say that is going to increase the value of this episode beyond all of the amazing stories and information that Alex provided to us. We do have some I keep saying photo workshops, but they're really not. We have a few all-day tours coming up.
Yeah, I was super excited for it. Started to fill them already?
Yeah, specific to the podcast. We have Maya's Legacy Whale Watching has all-day tours, and then we also have After the Breach all-day tours with Maya's Legacy. That'll be with Sara and I.
So May 17th and 18th, and then September 20th and 21st. It's a Saturday, Sunday. You sign up for both days. It's catered lunches. We're out on the water the full day. Donuts. We just kind of see where the day takes us, where the whales take us. They've been a lot of fun the last 2 years we've done them. So I'm excited to have a spring workshop workshop trip / whatever.
Spring and fall.
Yeah.
Our two favorite times to be out on the water here.
Yeah, if you're interested in signing up, space is limited. They've already started to fill. Shoot us an email if you're interested. I can get you all the details. We can get your registration form to sign up. But yeah, thanks guys so much for listening. And
yeah, and hey, if you want to take the time to send us some feedback, After the Breach podcast at gmail.com. We're also on Facebook and Instagram. Would love it if you would subscribe to the podcast, leave reviews, and share it with other people that you think might be interested. We really appreciate that. If you have any topic ideas or guests you'd like to hear interviewed on our podcast.
Yeah, those of you that have already sent emails or messages on social media about topic ideas, thank you so much. We really appreciate those. We're working on getting some speakers lined up to talk about those things specifically, and
got lots of really cool episodes coming up. We're going to be recording all winter, even with Sara in Australia.
Which I will be by the time this episode airs.
In the meantime, everybody,
stay safe out there. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of After the Breach podcast. If you've enjoyed it and want to help us out, please share this with your friends, family, and any other whale-loving folks you can think of. We would also love to hear your feedback, so please leave us a review wherever you listen to podcasts. If you have topics you're interested in and would like to hear on the show, please send us an email. We'd love to hear your thoughts. You can find us on Instagram as @AfterTheBreach and on Facebook as After the Breach Podcast. And if you'd like to go whale watching with us, then come on up to San Juan Island, Washington State. We run tours with Maya's Legacy Whale Watching, departing just steps away from the ferry landing in beautiful downtown Friday Harbor. It's a great destination for a day trip or multiple days and offers some of the best whale and wildlife viewing in the world. We would love to take you out on the water to see the amazing whales we talk about on our podcast. You can book a tour through the company website at www.sjiwhalewatch.com and make sure to mention you're a podcast listener when you book. Thanks again for listening, and remember, stay safe out there.